Okay, I just want to try to establish some context here and maybe ground and say I requested that formal charges be brought against Senator John Cornyn and Senator Ted Cruz and former Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, not only for the performance of the official roles at the time, including Secretary of Energy and Senator, but also for and in consideration of an understanding that things they had done prior to assuming those specific positions were evidence of crime, including acts of organized crime that had a material impact for the people of Texas, and by virtue of understanding the connection between crime in the state of Texas with concerns regarding crime at the federal level, that there were specific crimes that the three of them were indictable for and in regards to that are relevant in the material situation we're in now. And I've been having this situation that I've been conscious of at least since October of 2015, where something about my identity and Senator Ted Cruz's identity has gotten mixed up or swapped out or mistaken. And I understand that things he did politically before I even knew who he was were happening concurrent to events that were happening in my life, up to and including the time I was compelled to enter a hospital in San Francisco. Okay? And so now we're in the situation we're in. And I believe that what's happening now is I'm in some situation where I'm supposed to be a respondent. So does that then make me a respondent? And so far as the people of Texas are being tasked with some form of response based upon representation as the state of Texas, then that makes me what? The Solicitor General? Which would be a role that Senator Ted Cruz had formerly. But the whole consideration at work here now is that there are timelines that correlate with me letting the Supreme Court of Texas know that during a state of emergency, my understanding is that the crime ongoing at the time was so substantial that something needed to be engaged, including through what I understood was appropriate in connection with application of various laws that the state of Texas had specific to response to an emergency situation. And that the alleged attorney general at the time was not in any way, shape, or form actually exercising a role or in the duties of the attorney general, but rather that there was crime going on and that implicated the attorney general, which had implications for the manners in which the abuses by the governor were being allowed to proliferate unchecked. So, if you believe and understand that you were to make me the respondent, then I'm kind of confused because so far no charges have been brought against me. Rather, what it seems is again, somebody tried to take the actual claims I made and the actual charges I made and present them in a manner that then puts me in a position where I am supposed to defend that which I've actually charged. And this has been going on since February of 2016. Actually, specifically since, no, February of 2016. After I contacted, or even before, I contacted Congress with an official request for investigation, right? But after I was involved with political action that was attempting to engage in some sort of challenge to people who were in elected office and running in the election at that time. So let's ground this right now. And I just want to make a response to let you know that I consider these charges of swapping out people's concerns about their genetic information with vehicular references, including authorization to operate an emergency vehicle, very seriously. And it is absolutely disgraceful that the state of Texas, for instance, requires all members of law enforcement to be certified that they have received several hours worth of training specifically in identification and addressing and concerning acts of human trafficking as a requirement for their job. And that means every time a member of law enforcement refuses to respond appropriately and legally to what they understand to be acts of human trafficking, they are actually in violation of the requirements for their job. And They jeopardize whatever is actually dependent upon their certification, and the role of that specific certification is a demonstration they've been trained, which has a material impact on the municipality in which they are operating and that they serve. This is something that's been going on the entire time I've been here. I have absolutely no evidence that any actual member of law enforcement, up to and including the chief of police in at least two cities, right? The chief of police in two cities actually addresses acts of trafficking as trafficking. And by law, every member of the police department is required to have received training and certification that they've participated in training regarding how to address acts of human trafficking. It's also important that trafficking is also a federal offense, which means when you're encountering acts of human trafficking, you have to have more of a relationship with federal law enforcement than just saying, well, I'm sorry, we can't help you. I can give you the address to the FBI. That's not adequate and that's not acceptable. And this has been the experience I personally have had the entire time I've been in Texas. On the other hand, there are policies and there are processes that have been ongoing the last several years that brought concern up. I've already discussed several times the alarm that I have over the Texas Impact Drivers Program. Specifically, the fact that on the books, the law in the state of Texas requires Texas to have a separate drivers program for people getting their driver's license who are above the age of 24 than it does for people who are under the age of 24, including 18 to 24 or ages 16 to 18. And for whatever reason, up until now, I understand, or at least up until the last time I checked, which was March of 2021, they were more than 3 years into the requirement that they have a separate program for adult drivers, and they just refused to actually follow the law. It was their law. They passed the law. They were the ones that implemented a 3-tier process for drivers programs in the state of Texas. And they also wanted to identify it as being a project that was inspired by one that was started in the state of California. This is what you are required to do to become a driver. And yet, if you're over 25 or over 24, you're required to go through that program with those who are under that age, that are under the age where they can be held legally accountable for certain matters. And this is completely unacceptable. Every single person trying to get their driver's license is required to take an online training program and get a certificate. And they take that certificate to the Department of Public Safety in order to get their driver's license. And if you don't use that certificate within 6 months, it expires. And you have to do it again. And I contend that they are engaged in massive, massive securities fraud in consideration of those certificates that everybody who wants to get a driver's license is required to get after they do an online training. And I've already provided public reporting on the significant problems with the online training program, specifically the English versus the Spanish edition, and how the translation issues are, I believe, very sabotatory, and specific references that I believe are actually attempting to excitate a sort of behavior from young drivers that is not responsible, and that those that were in charge of making that program and verifying that program and making it a requirement of all first-time drivers should have known better than to do. It was not appropriate as a behavioral science experiment. And that's what they've been doing. And in the course of doing this, we have this situation where how is one supposed to acclimate to being addressed as if they are some sort of motor vehicle? I want to know, how do you expect people that are conscious and capable of dealing with the fact that the only manner in which you will address their needs and their livelihood is as if they're some form of motor vehicle? There were a series of public comments that I responded to in July of 2019. I had gone through and I found that there was a number of them. There's a specific website where they have public comments periods that come up. And I went through them one day. I was not aware at the time that the Army Futures Command was in the course of presenting a report to the the Committee for Small Businesses for the United States Senate. which was presented on July 17th of 2019. I didn't know that at the time, but on July 16th and 17th of 2019, I responded to a number of public comments. One of them was for the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and the other one was for the Environmental Protection Agency. I bring these up now because they're very relevant today. The one I submitted to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration had to do with a public comment period that was talking about addressing license exemptions for improperly licensed vehicles. And it discussed a maximum exemption of 10 at a time. And when I read this, my concern is that it was some sort of non-specific reference to a series of 10 licenses that could be exempted out of a larger class of any number of licenses. And of course, the metric 10 has a very specific implication, and not so ironically, came up very significantly during the 2020 election season, as well as the earlier part of this year. If this has anything to do with it, I cannot say. Many of the things that were mentioned during that public comment period and other public comment periods appear in the media, especially media reports on actions that have been engaged by members of Congress, but also things that actually happened during the floor sessions, legislative floor sessions at the federal level that have a direct, somewhat staggered impact on what happens locally. This was after or right around the time when there was an appointment of a new national director of intelligence who happened to be a former representative from northern Texas, from this area. A former congressman from this area was appointed to be the national director of intelligence. And my concern was that if Texas hasn't taken care of its own licensing program, and it is using, which I suspected it was using actual driver's licenses, including the contract numbers associated with driver's licenses, as some part of a process whereby they were able to justify accessing biometric accounts that had been created on people, including through surveillance in public centers or in connection with things that they would have to do as part of registration for a school or a job. And they were using those biometric accounts and trying to say it was for some sort of national security or intelligence related reason. That the failure, for instance, to apply actual accountability for flagrant violation of laws concerning the driver's license program belied an even more criminal implication. And a criminal implication that they were trying to mask under the cover of national security by taking somebody that would be directly responsible, as he had previously been involved with the Committee for Department for Homeland Security, and was in the jurisdiction of a major area of concern within the state of Texas. And if he had failed to actually address the potential criminal implications in the manner that he had available to him at the time, that making him the director of intelligence at the time was akin to saying, we're going to go ahead and give you insurance to cover up these crimes. And so this is one of the things that was going on that I was concerned was going to happen. And so that's why I wrote the public comment I did, which was very brief. But it said, please assure that this is not an exemption for improperly licensed vehicles being used in acts of securities fraud and human trafficking. And this ironic thing is, if you watch the Texas Impact Drivers program, and you see the way that they try to present these scenarios around unsafe driving, it is almost as if they're trying to excitate this sort of psychological impulse to be snarky, to act out, to try to exaggerate, almost as if it's taunting you. And in the course of taunting you, it's trying to prove that it's smarter than you by tricking you into engaging in some sort of behavior, because what they're doing is they're blatantly and flagrantly doing that which you know is wrong. But they're pretending like there's nothing wrong with it until they get enough leverage to say, now we can get you. And that's what I understood they were actually doing in the driver's program. They were presenting information in a way to kind of give a suggestion that there were these kind of moments intended to excitate people into acting out in a belligerent manner, with an understanding that from their superior positioning, including in terms of access to surveillance and tools of law enforcement, or in this case, national security, that they would continue to provoke you, even in a manner where they were intentionally engaging in violations of the law, right in front of you, knowing that that's what they were doing, with the intent of trying to compel you to act in a manner that then could justify them saying you were unsafe. That they were recruiting people to be hostile. That they were excitating people to be belligerents. Almost as if it was this sort of game of chicken. To see, well, who's going to flinch first? And so when you have things like the Impact Texas Drivers Program, that is intentionally not administered in a manner that follows the law, and any attempt to dress that legally is repeatedly met with an attempt to try to put it in some sort of almost parody of extreme belligerence that is supposed to be requited. That they're going to act in a way that's completely unreasonable to compel you to match their unreasonable behavior. But you have to understand that their superior position at any given time is capable of coming in and shutting it down, or swapping you out, or saying, you know what, we're done with you. You have to go back to the other side, or you have to go back to the other end of the pipeline, because there's no accountability. And part of the way there's no accountability is they get to masquerade that something has a national security implication or is intelligence related, as a way to say, well, we can violate the law. We can say it's confidential. We can say it's classified. We can say it's a state secret. And then we can continue to engage in behavior that is intentionally orchestrated to challenge your perception of what is actually a reasonable standard until you get frustrated, and then you act out based upon pre-programmed triggers, including triggers that have become a part of a sort of surveillance culture, where you try to get a response and then they give you some sort of a boilerplate language that doesn't actually literally make sense until you get it over and over again every time you try to get resources. And then at some point, it is meant to, especially if there is some concurrent process of trying to target you with directed energy in a manner to hyper-excitate your hormones, or to attempt to actually target parts of your body so that you have physical pain while you're in the encounter. Because what they want is an outburst. They want you to act out in a way that then can justify them saying something like, you need to lower your voice. They've been trained. They've been trained to trigger you and provoke you until you give them just the information they want. And then once they get that, well, then they got to shut you down. And there's trigger words and there's phrases that they've been trained to say that are supposed to remind you psychologically, you don't have any legitimacy. You raised your voice level too high. And this is the threshold. You're going to have to be quiet. That's paired with actual things that I have found recently in opinions by the former Attorney General, who is now the senator, right? That's why there's a big difference when you put me in the position of the respondent versus the position of the non-respondent, right? If you put me in a situation where I'm supposed to answer for actions of the state, former attorneys general of the state of Texas have set up kickback schemes. And part of that kickback scheme has to do with illegal implications and execution of processes related to eminent domain that have to do with processes of condemnation. And you see this repeatedly, especially if you're talking about the crypto economy and the manners in which the crypto economy functions within particular municipalities, including in a system of automation that is available in what used to be identified as public information law, but now, well, it's not accessible in the same manner because of the unconstitutional application of laws regarding alleged confidentiality. And one of the things that happens is you're trying to get your resource needs met. They refer you to something you're supposed to agree to do that is not directly related to what you're doing. And then once you acknowledge that and try to move into actually securing commitment to get what you need, they condemn it. They downgrade it. They bash it. Whatever you're talking about. Oh, all of a sudden there's a problem. There's a crisis. There's a catastrophe. And then you're supposed to figure out how to respond to it as a catastrophe, as a problem, as a crisis, which means, you know what? You're going to need other resources. Because you came here without actually having that kind of a crisis. But while you were here, we manufactured you to have that crisis. And now you have been determined to be a public safety hazard or a public health hazard, or people don't feel safe around you. We're condemning you, and now the state is going to claim what you have. And once the state claims what you have, well, then you have to go get your resources. And in the course of the resources, other people are hooking up contracts. And if you do the right thing and make sure certain people that have already been hooked up get their contract bids, at some point in time down the road, you're going to get your chance. And you're not supposed to ask too many questions about who's actually provided the human capital or even the identity, including the demographics of that identity that you're being offered on that bid and that bid opportunity. And that's why the other thing that ended up appearing on the federal level was so alarming. The Environmental Protection Agency had a recommendation regarding air quality standards regarding state implementation plans. And my concern is that we just passed an anniversary regarding the Air Quality Act. Yeah, this was in September. This was September, I believe, of 2019. So it was around this time. And in the course of that, there were still all of these outstanding matters related to the Affordable Care Act and the concept of these state marketplaces. And so this consideration of state implementation plans regarding a federal standard, while there were certain kinds of legislation pending, was very concerning. And one of the major concerns was something called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act of 2018. And then there was another one for 2019. Now, my concern is that regardless of whether or not bills like this get formally passed as the full piece of legislation, that what happens is during the course of their consideration, they may be selected out or accepted out and put into appropriations processes that are ongoing at the time. So if you don't know where it has been categorized and you don't understand, including through review of committee processes or actually going through the line items, including the budgets associated with appropriations processes, you may not know where the specific elements that are explicitly recommended in a piece of legislation end up actually being engaged and implemented through the appropriations process, which is one of the reasons why I attempted to have consideration of the appropriations process for 2018 that was ongoing during 2017 evaluated from a consideration of it as a demonstrable of a pattern of racketeering. I contend it has actually been proven to be such in the last several years, and that the things that have happened last year and this year related to the alleged appropriations process are completely misrepresentative and really only possible because of the impunity of the abuse of the appropriations process that had been allowed to go on prior to that. But one of the things about this bill that's concerning and makes me think that it's actually been done before is within this bill, it talks about assignments it makes for addressing air quality standards and the implication of an experiment regarding monitoring that would by default revert back to prior air quality standards modalities if the test regime did not perform in accordance with expectations. Now, that's how I articulated it. In the actual bill, there is a section that discusses a 10-year period for a implementation of a alternative strategy when it comes to monitoring air quality. And it was supposed to be unrolled in a 10-year period as part of and in connection with some kind of control group. And after 10 years, and various things that were implemented during the course of that 10 years, it was to be evaluated to see if the manner in which it had been applied somehow yielded some consideration of a better standard when it came to addressing air quality issues than what had already been put into law. But what it implies is that there's going to be a 10-year period where a majority of people, civilians, the regular people, are going to be operating as if we are living in a world where there is one particular manner in which air quality is addressed and is monitored. But there's going to be some concurrent process, an experimental process that most likely is going to be presented to us as if it's just a test case or it's just a simulation, if we hear about it at all, but may actually literally involve doing things to orchestrate or manipulate the environment connected to either areas or individuals or entities that are allowed to be identified as the subjects of these experiments. And it's meant to be for 10 years. So for 10 years, you're going to be subjected to some experimental process. And if they don't like the results, what happens? If they do like the results, what happens? The point is, there's a 10-year period where certain communities are supposed to be subjected to some kind of experiment. And the indication and the implication is they're not going to be told about it beforehand. They're not going to be put in a process where they're given a possibility for consenting, which means also actively engaging. And that also means holding accountable whoever it was that believes they're authorized to either administer